Hello and welcome to True Audiophiles. Today I am going to talk about, as if you couldn't tell already, the Van Halen Fair Warning album. Biggest reason for that is because of the OneStep release that just came out. I have number 260 out of 5,000, and they basically I just got this earlier in the week this week. Been a long time coming. I think I've had it on pre-order for a couple years now. So a little bit about, not a little bit about the actual album itself, but this one I'm not sure how how popular this is going to be in comparison to especially the first album and maybe even the second album. Maybe it'll be as popular as Women and Children First, but it's definitely, unless you're a hardcore Van Halen fan, I think that it doesn't get the love that maybe it deserves. I've listened to it a few extra times this week preparing for this video, and it's a great album. It just doesn't have any, a lot of, hits. Unchained is really the only song that I knew well on this album before this week. I've listened to it every now and then previously, but just never really given it probably the chance it deserves. So glad that I've been able to get a chance now that I've got the OneStep and was able to do kind of the demos. So what I will say and kind of tell you, I've got 3 other copies of this album that I'm going to compare to. The first version that I have is the most recent reissue that Chris Bellman cut. My understanding, and I'm not sure if it's true, is that it was cut from the original analog tapes. The MoFi one, if you don't already know, and if you don't, you probably live under a rock if you follow vinyl stuff and know the controversies around MoFi, is they basically, typically how they do these nowadays is they take the original master tape, they personally digitize it. They don't use the digitized version from the label, but they use their own equipment to digitize it, and then once they've got that digital copy, then they cut from that, and in this case they use the one-step process to press it. So yeah, so that's that. Again, the Chris Bellman, from what I've heard, is cut from the original master tape directly. Don't know if that's true. Maybe you guys out there can kind of reaffirm that for me if not. But anyway, so I have that one. I also have an early German pressing. It's a first or early pressing of the German version of it. And then last, certainly not least, I have a beat up, but early, maybe first pressing. It, from what I can tell from Discogs, it looks like it's a release from the same year that it came out. So it could be a first, but it's certainly an early pressing of it. Unfortunately, like I said, it's a little bit beat up, but it was good enough to be able to listen to. So kind of let you know about my process and how I do these shootouts is I basically listened to the new release that came out, so in this case the OneStep, all the way through. Listen to it to try to get a sense for it, and also try to figure out what song or songs I want to use to do an A-B comparison. And in this case, the only obvious choice for me was Unchained, just because I know it better than any of the other tracks on the album. And none of the other tracks really stood out to me as being better than Unchained for a sound quality check. So that's what I went with. So I did that. I also do a level check. I have a sound meter, and I make sure I try to keep the playback of all of the albums within, hopefully within about a half a dB, but about a dB of sound, just because a noticeable sound difference is something that a louder playback is perceived to be sounding better. So I tried to keep them all within about a half a dB of each other. The thing that shouldn't be much of a surprise, but sometimes MoFi cuts them a little quiet, but in this case, this one was definitely the loudest cut of all of the different versions that I had. The other 3 were relatively close to one another, but all of them basically were cut softer than the OneStep. And that's because the OneStep's 2 LPs, 45 RPM, so they could spread out the grooves a little bit more and cut it louder. So, and that's what they did. All right, so talk about the OneStep and playing through. I will say, at first, listen. A couple things stood out to me. The first one was it was a little noisier than I was expecting for a super vinyl. Now, that's and I want to stress, for a super vinyl, because relatively speaking, it's actually a pretty quiet pressing. But this is probably one of the noisier fidelity pressing super vinyl pressings I have. You know, ones that have been pressed at Fidelity Pressing, their most recent pressing plant that Mobile Fidelity has opened up. Now, having said that, it's still super quiet, but definitely a little bit noisier than I was expecting. And I was wondering if it was maybe because it wasn't a super vinyl, because I know that, I believe it's Bitches Brew, they pressed it on regular vinyl. They didn't use super vinyl. And I noticed that was a little bit noisier for a OneStep, and that was why. But when I did the research, everything tells me that it looks like it's a super vinyl, and I did hold it up to the light and it was somewhat transparent, which is how you could tell if it's a super vinyl. You could kind of see through it if you hold it up to a light, where you can't if it's a regular vinyl. So I would say that it most likely is super vinyl, but it was for a super vinyl, it's a little bit on the noisy side. So, but regardless of that, I played it through. The first thing that struck me, besides the the quietness or lack thereof of the super vinyl, was the power of the bass. It was definitely, you know, chest thumping. You could feel it and hear it, and you can definitely, but it wasn't bloated and distorted. It was clean, deep, tight bass. You know, for some of you who are not big bass fans, maybe it was a little bit over the top for those of you who don't like, you know, a lot of bass. But to me, I thought it was great, because it was still great. There was definitely a decent amount of bass there, but it wasn't over the top distorted, or it was clean and natural sounding, so you could hear the bass guitar and you can hear the bass drum and differentiate between them, and then you can feel them as well. So, but you know, overall I thought it sounded very good. Great sound stage width and depth, and a great naturalness of sound. Definitely sounded very dynamic as well. So next one I put on was the Chris Bellman copy. Chris Bellman copy I thought sounded really, really good as well. Now, I would say it had a very similar sound stage, very similar both in width and depth. The things that I probably noticed the most as differences, though, is the tone EQ was a little bit different. There was definitely less bass on it. Definitely more, for those of you who like neutral sounding, you could probably classify this one as a little bit more neutral than the OneStep, but I thought overall it sounded very good. You definitely still heard and felt the bass a little bit. It just wasn't as powerful as it was on the OneStep, in my personal opinion. The other thing that I definitely noticed, and this is very minor, and I think the only way you really pick up on it is if you're really kind of A-Bing like I have and doing that comparison, is I would say the naturalness and clarity of some of the recording is better on the MoFi. And what really stuck out to me, where I noticed it the most, was I think it's a crash cymbal, which is off to the slightly off to the right on Unchained. And when you compare that crash cymbal on the OneStep in comparison to the Chris Bellman, it sounded clearer, more natural. Like you could definitely hear it better in the MoFi than you could on the Chris Bellman. Chris Bellman one still sounds phenomenal though, so don't take anything away from it in that respect. But that was the one thing that I picked up on, and it is relatively minor. You really have to listen for it to hear it. So that was kind of my take between the two of those. Pressing was definitely good and quiet. A little tiny bit noisier maybe than the OneStep, but not by much. So then I tried the German copy, and the German copy, it still sounded pretty good. It was a little noisier which kind of surprised me, because German pressings are typically known to be relatively quiet, but this one was a little bit on the noisy side. Definitely didn't have the clarity that the Bellman or the OneStep had. I would say that it also sounded like it may have been a little bit more compressed, and that was definitely noticeable when there were cymbal hits and things like that. It definitely had that compression sound to it. So I just think that's just, the way these things were done back, in '81 when this came out. So I don't take anything away from the cut of it. I think that's just the way they mastered them back then. And where I think the Bellman and the OneStep are more looking for the audiophile level versions of it. So anyway, I thought it sounded okay. Wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. Then I put on the US pressing, the early or first pressing of the US pressing. I definitely think it sounded a little bit better than the German. I think that the German definitely didn't have anywhere near as much bass as the Bellman, or definitely no as much as the OneStep. And I definitely think that the US pressing maybe had a little tiny bit more bass, not a lot, but a little tiny bit more bass to it. But I'd say the overall clarity was pretty similar. If I had to give an edge to one, the US pressing maybe had a little tiny bit of an edge, but it was really hard for me to tell just because it was a kind of a noisy copy, because it's a well-loved copy. I'd say it's a, VG minus at best copy of it. So it was a little harder to kind of tell on that. But I would say overall, the OneStep definitely I probably felt a little bit more dynamic than the rest of them. I think that it had a little bit more of a naturalness of the sound on the cymbals. I would say the Bellman, though, one thing I didn't mention before, the Bellman seemed like it had maybe a little bit more mid-range, and that really kind of showed up in the guitar. It definitely maybe had a little bit more of an edginess to it, a slight bit more, not a lot bit more, but I did notice that. The one other thing that I definitely noticed more on the Bellman one, and I think I heard it on the OneStep, but it may not have been as obvious, is, and I think this maybe has to do with the mid-range on the Bellman, is there definitely seemed to be an issue on the tape on the intro on the guitar on Unchained. There's a little bit of a hiccup, for lack of a better way to describe it, on the Bellman that I couldn't quite hear as well. It may have been there on the OneStep, but didn't really notice it as much. But it's definitely clearly audible to me, at least, on the Bellman copy. So take that for what it is. I would say overall, so if I had to rank them, and this is all personal preference, objectivity aside, I would say I personally prefer the OneStep. I can definitely see that how some people may not like it because of the bass, and would probably prefer the Bellman over the OneStep if you're talking about from a tone perspective, especially because of that extra mid-range punch or edge to it, which for a guitar-driven album could be pretty important. So I could definitely see preferring the Bellman in that respect. So, but I rank it second over the OneStep, and then I'd say the US early pressing would be third, and then the German would be fourth. Overall, I would say that if you're a big Fair Warning fan, I personally think it's worth investing in the OneStep. I think you won't be dissatisfied with it unless you just don't like a lot of bass, like I've talked about. But if you want to do this on a budget and you don't already have the most recent Chris Bellman version, I can't see you being disappointed with that. That's a phenomenal copy, and I'd say, $30 versus $125, it's definitely going to be, without a doubt, the best bang for your buck. But I feel that the OneStep definitely has that edge, and if you really like this album, I think it's worth investing in it. So that's kind of my take. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Do you know of a copy that's out there that I didn't demo and do an A/B comparison with that you feel is maybe even better than all the ones I'm talking about here, especially if you've heard the OneStep and you've compared it to some other ones? Do you have a favorite that's not the OneStep or the Bellman? I'd really like to hear your take on it. The most recent Bellman one, because I believe that there was a Bellman one that came out a few years ago that I think they cut it from the digital master. And from everything I've heard anyways, this newer reissue that Bellman did, I want to say is, I don't remember, I want to say I can't remember the years. If I can find information on the specifics, I'll put it in the text on this video. But regardless, there are two Bellman copies. The most recent one, which is the one that's available, I believe still available right now, is considered by people that I've talked to, the better Bellman cut. So maybe it's just because of the psychology of the fact that it supposedly is cut from the original analog master tape as opposed to cut from digital. I don't know, but that's what I've heard. But I'd love to hear your take and what you think. So I want to thank you very much for watching my video. Please like the video if you liked what you saw here. If you subscribe, I want to thank you for subscribing. If you don't subscribe, please hit that subscribe button. I'd love to see some more subscribers. And that is everything that I have for this week. I want to thank you very much for watching. I want you to have a good rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Thanks a lot.